Spread the fire, fam. This is an emergency episode, so I'm just going to get straight into it. Firstly, I want to say if you're new around here, I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. And my goodness, we've got a new cabinet. We've got ministers from new parties for the first time ever. We've got more deputy ministers than a church in Sandton. It's a lot. And today I really want to take you through all that's happened with the cabinet announcement. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to start with just breaking down exactly what's been happening all through the weekend up to the announcement by the president late on Sunday night. Once we do that, I want to have a look at the cabinet itself, the ministries, the portfolios, the way things have been divided up, because I think there's a really interesting and fascinating situation that we need to unpack and analyze, and I'll help you understand that. And then finally look at some of the remaining questions that pervade this cabinet now that it has already been announced, and now that this government must hit the ground running and the clock has already begun on its need to deliver. What I will do in a separate video is look at this from the perspective of the opposition, particularly MK and the EFF. So look out for that. I should be dropping that soon after this video, but there's so much to discuss that I want to break it up and look at the cabinet first and then look at what opposition politics means later. So let's have a look at all that's happened, and also just to say before we kick into gear, help us get to 200,000 subscribers by the end of this year. If you are watching this, please do subscribe. As you can see, it's an emergency episode. I'm having to do this all myself, so please do forgive any sound or visual issues today, but I know that this audience wants the material now, and I thought it would be better to just get the analysis to you as soon as I can. Cool. So having said that, I said I'd start with some of the background. So let's take it since my last video, because I've been taking you on a journey throughout this election. So let's have a look at Friday. Things went eerily quiet. No one was talking, no real statements. We had just emerged from the letter saga where it looked like the DA-ANC deal could have been on the brink of breaking down. Saturday comes through, and then we have this interesting twist where the EFF publishes a letter which is a record of its meeting with the ANC, and the EFF basically says to the ANC, look, we're not making big demands on you, we just want to be part of the cabinet, but we don't want the DA as part of this cabinet. And I think what the EFF is trying to do there is quell this narrative that they had made unreasonable demands to the ANC. So people are in a bit of uncertainty. Will the ANC take this seriously, or is it a last gasp attempt to join the government, or is it just an attempt to divert that criticism of the EFF? So we get that on Saturday, but what we then also get late that night is hints that an ANC-DA deal has actually been struck. And so we're waiting on Sunday, and then on Sunday we wake up, and later in the day we hear that President Cyril Ramaphosa will announce his cabinet at 9 p.m. that night, the Sunday night, the 30th of June. 9 p.m. More on that later. So eventually Ramaphosa arrives closer to 10 than 9. And I must say, just in terms of government communication going forward, and for all political parties, just give us a time that you think you can meet. If you think it's going to be a certain time, give us an hour later. But it's a bad look, and it's a bad way to kick off a new government to make people wait for nearly an hour and to start late. So I think that's something hopefully we can rid not only from government but throughout our politics, and get back to politicians who not only deliver on time with their promises but also with their addresses. Having said that, we all stayed up, we waited to watch the cabinet, and my, did we get some interesting outcomes. So let me have a look at this cabinet for you, and let's try and break it down to understand what exactly has happened. So I think one of the key things to look at is, let's look at the cabinet itself before we get into the people who are filling the cabinet, because we've seen some reconfiguration of the cabinet. First, what struck me is the decision to bad choice of word, to let go of the Public Enterprises Ministry. And you'll remember this is a ministry that oversaw various state-owned enterprises from SAA to Eskom at a certain period. And to actually move much of that into the presidency. So we have a much more powerful presidency now than we had a few months ago. And we already have a very powerful presidency. And that's something I want to touch on later when we look at this cabinet, because it's something that I'm greatly worried about. And when you think of a presidency, you shouldn't think of the incumbent in the presidency. You should think of the institution and how much power it has. So the president has taken much of public enterprises in-house. And, what I think we should guard against is a sovereign president. There's been a lot of talk of what's called parliamentary sovereignty, which is something that the MK has advocated for, which means that Parliament can do whatever it wants, basically. I don't think South Africa is even close to that problem. However, presidential sovereignty, I think, is something we do need to think about. Our president, comparatively in the world, already has a lot of power, but with a diminishing opposition and a civil society that isn't really prepared to criticize the president, and a media landscape which is basically congratulatory of the president, I'm very worried that we're entering a stage where President Cyril Ramaphosa can basically do whatever he wants. And he has taken massive economic powers into his presidency now. Not only economic policy, but he basically now runs state-owned enterprises effectively in-house as well. So he's got all these companies under his supervision and leadership, all this constitutional power, and very little counterweight to what he determines. Do we have a sovereign president? I think that's an interesting question that I haven't heard anyone asking. Now, what is clear from the president's perspective is that I think he has negotiated extremely effectively in the following sense. He has done very well to secure his own power, and he has done very well to secure power for the ANC, which, remember, sits on 39% of the vote and now has a vast majority of cabinet and an even vaster majority of the deputy ministers. So if negotiating well means securing power for yourself, then I think President Cyril Ramaphosa has played a blinder. However, if negotiating well means putting yourself in a position to deliver as a government and actually doing something with that power, that remains to be seen. Because my view of the president is that he is absolutely brilliant at securing power for himself and his party. But he is absolutely terrible at doing anything meaningful with that power. That was the story of his first administration, and we'll have to see if that's the story of his second administration. But the second administration has begun with Cyril Ramaphosa negotiating a power deal which has been very generous to him and his party. So that's the presidency, and I think what's also interesting is that the president has managed to dispel any suggestions that opposition parties would really get anywhere near the presidency. Paul Mashatile remains deputy president, and so the ANC has firmed up not only the speaker, but also the deputy president and the president, and I think they can be very happy with that from 39% of the electorate. Now, there were a number of other ministries that have merged or been split. And I think that's also worth looking at. So the first that I suggested we would see in a previous video is merging energy and electricity. Much of the regulatory power around the former electricity ministry sat with energy, and then at the same time energy was tied to electricity, and so we had this unequal divide between, in some ways, public enterprises, energy, and electricity. Now, it seems to me that all of that has been consolidated, public enterprises in the presidency, and then electricity and energy in one, and that's still Hosienzo Ramaphosa. So I think that's a huge vote of confidence in Ramaphosa. I would watch Ramaphosa as a rising star within the ANC, and he's one of very few ministers who not only remained in cabinet, but also retained his portfolio. And now he's got an even more powerful portfolio, and he really sits at the opportunity of being able to resolve load shedding over these 5 years. He's got a DA deputy minister, so together those two can take a lot of political credit if they continue with the momentum that South Africa has seen around reducing the intensity of load shedding. However, what is interesting to me is that we still don't have a sense that load shedding is over. So what happens, and a big danger for this government, is the instant it comes back, because that reverses all the optimism and the momentum around this government of national unity. Now let's talk about some of the splits, because we got a split in higher education and science and technology. We got a split in land reform and agriculture. And we got a very interesting development in the international relations portfolio, where a key minister, Naledi Pandor, who to my mind was the best minister in the last administration, has left. There was some speculation she'd be brought back in, even though she's not in parliament. And we got Ronald Lamola moving from justice. So, and then we got justice and correctional services being split into 2 ministries again. Now, in terms of these splits, I'm a little worried that what we're seeing here is an attempt to further bloat cabinet, which was trimmed even slightly in the first administration, in order to distribute patronage among these new GNU opposition parties. It's as if the patronage that was once distributed and the positions that were once distributed inside the ANC have now moved to being distributed outside the ANC. And it's a grave pity that opposition parties who campaigned on cutting the size of cabinet, when push came to shove, decided that a bloated cabinet which included them was a better thing than a smaller cabinet which maybe didn't include so many parties. So I think it's really sad, disastrous, and quite frankly counterproductive that we've had promises of a leaner cabinet for 5 years, and we may have promises going into 10 years, but the actual data is just going in the complete opposite direction. I think we had something like 64 ministers and deputy ministers going into this, and we now have an obscene 76. Particularly the deputy ministries have just swollen and bloated to absurd proportions. And I think as a country, we really do need to ask ourselves, why do we need 14 more deputy ministerial salaries? Why do we need 14 more deputy ministerial perks? Why do we need 14 more sets of blue lights? Just why do we need all these deputy ministers in addition to an already large cabinet? And how much are we spending on this that we could be spending in other directions? And what do we make of just failed promises on which this administration starts to cut cabinet? I don't understand our, inconsistency when it comes to failed promises. It feels like when some people break their promises or go back on their word, that's a flip-flop, or that's an indictment. When other people do it, it's unfortunate. And I think it's really sad that we have this obese cabinet. Okay, so having said that, let's have a look at the actual portfolios and how they were delivered. Just a reminder before we do that, there are 4 ways you can help to support this channel. You can subscribe, like, share. You can become a member of this channel down below. You can drop me a super thanks in the ribbon down below. You can also invite me to speak at your institution and company. And if you want to advertise, our contact details are in the description box below. Okay, so let's get back to it. Let's talk the politics, right? So the ANC retains a very impressive around 60% of this cabinet for them, right? Remember, this was a change election. The ANC was down and out, electorally obliterated. And through this so-called GNU arrangement, they have become reborn into this cabinet, and in many ways sit in a similar position to where they were, certainly in terms of deputy ministries, before the election. So the ANC, I think, has something like nearly 80% of the deputy ministries and over 60% of the ministries. It's kept the presidency, it's kept international relations, it's kept key security portfolios like defense and police. So the ANC has done very well. Now the DA, of course, we had this big battle between the ANC and the DA, and the DA first said they wanted 11 ministers, plus their deputies and the DGs. It's clear that the DA really walked back many of its promises, and the DA took a decision that getting into government, even if it was going to be a relatively meager offer from the ANC, which I think it was in the end, was more important than sitting on the sidelines. That remains to be seen, the wisdom of that. So what do we have here? We've got the DA with important ministries for it, like agriculture, like communications, like home affairs. So I think those kinds of important ministries, of course, basic education as well, environment, forestry and fisheries is another one that they've got. So they've got 6 portfolios, but I think they would be a little bit disappointed. You know, anywhere in the world, when you form a coalition government, you usually get someone much higher up the food chain. And the DA has really got those ministries which might not be thought of as absolutely essential. They're important, of course, and they are key to government delivery. But what the DA, I think, needs to ward against is that they may deliver for the ANC government and make the ANC look good, but not actually get the political credit themselves. Of course, they'll be bargaining that they will outperform other ministers, and that will make the DA itself look better than other parties. But if the DA delivers or outperforms, as they claim they're able to do, that may end up just making the ANC look good. So I think that's interesting. Now, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who's come on this channel many times, shout out to her. I think that's a fascinating ministry for her to take control of. When I last interviewed her, I told her that she was going to be high up in the government, and we must go back to that clip. But I think that's a good move for the DA. We have new blood in basic education, and I do wish Sizwe all the best with that ministry. A young black woman taking charge of one of the country's most important ministries, I think, is to be celebrated. And I look forward to seeing what happens with basic education and where the DA goes with that, because I think that's a big opportunity for them and for Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Solly Malatsi in communications, I think, is also interesting. By the way, remember the predictions on this channel of who in the DA would get a ministry if they ended up with them. Now, this is key because just never mind the SABC and all of that. Creating digital infrastructure is a key driver for economic growth. We have such a vibrant and energetic young digital population, and they continue to be hamstrung by high data costs, a lack of bandwidth. And I think if we can open up the economy so that creative young people can access information in ways that are internationally competitive, then we really move towards a potentially vibrant new economic future. So I think that'll be interesting. Exactly how the DA deals with politics inside the SABC, the public broadcaster, making that institution solvent, but also dedicated to its public mandate, that will be a massive task because politics at the SABC are rife and rampant, and there will be a new dimension to those politics now that there isn't only one political master in town, but in fact the DA and the ANC will be jostling for control over the SABC because it's a key communications infrastructure. Now, agriculture and land reform is an interesting one for me because on the one hand, you've got John Steenhuisen, who takes agriculture, which used to be rolled into land reform and rural development. And then you get the PAC getting land reform. Now, this seems to be a kind of double gift to two different constituencies that just looks incoherent to me, right? Firstly, it's very difficult to separate land reform from agriculture because commercial agriculture is such a fundamental part of land redistribution and land policy. And that was the thinking behind combining those ministries in the first place, because the imperatives of land reform inevitably bridge upon the agricultural sector. Now, to split agriculture out and give it to the DA, which we know has a much more conservative stance on land reform, and then to give land reform to the PAC, which has maybe one of the most radical stances on land reform of any party, seems like incoherent to me. It seems like giving meat to different constituencies without a real plan to actually deliver. Because what happens if the PAC pursues an aggressive land reform strategy and expropriation without compensation policies while the DA is in the Ministry of Agriculture and pushes back against that? So I just don't know how that's going to work, and I think it's just incoherent when you really look at it in more depth. As for the IFP, I think they've done very well for themselves, which I suspect they thought they were going to do, with Mkhuleko Hlengwa in the Deputy Ministry of Transport, which is a key portfolio, but then Velenkosi Hlabisa, the IFP leader, in cooperative governance and traditional affairs. Now, why would that be interesting? Number one, it puts the IFP at the center of the bridge between local government, or the link between local government, or the interface between local government and national government and provincial government, but particularly local government and national government. So this is really kind of how national policies are supposed to filter through into the coalface of service delivery. So the IFP is right at the center of questions of basic services across the country. And given that their support bases tends to be regionally condensed, that's quite a coup for them. But then, of course, traditional affairs as well. So the IFP is able to also sit at the interface between the national government and traditional leadership structures. And of course, that will be important for the IFP, particularly with its relationship and its engagements to the AmaZulu royal house. But there are, of course, national questions about traditional leadership more widely, and the IFP will sit right at the center of those. And then Mkhuleko Hlengwa, it's good to see a younger minister coming into transport as well. Now, let's talk about some of the other parties. Of course, you've got Bantu Holomisa, who's the UDM president. Also interviewed him on this channel before the election. And he is the Deputy Minister of Defense. Now, I don't know if this is a wise move for the UDM, because they've kind of sat between two stools. On the one hand, moving closer towards the EFF, MK, and the Progressive Caucus. But now, on the other hand, coming into the Government of National Unity. And there's a danger for the UDM that they alienate two different constituencies at once, because I think that the EFF and MK will be quite disappointed and maybe angry with them for jumping ship, whereas they have also criticized a lot the ANC and the DA on the other hand. So they may end up in a position where they're neither loved by one nor the other. On the other hand, Bantu Holomisa, for his career, I suppose a deputy ministry in defense is an important thing. He's probably looking towards thinking about retirement in the next few years, and he has a military background, so that's an interesting one. Angie Motshekga, though, must be regarded as the terminator of the South African cabinet. Like Destiny's Child's Survivor song must just come on wherever Angie Motshekga walks. You must just hear that song going, because, like, wow, if she makes it to the end of this term, she will have been a minister for 20 years. And a lot of ANC ministers lost their positions in this election. Pravin Gordhan, gone. Thulas Nxesi, Bheki Cele, Noxolo Kivet, for example. People like this actually just are no longer with us in this cabinet, and there's actually quite a long list. But somehow, Angie Motshekga has survived, and she's moved on to defense. So that should be interesting to watch, shall we say. Now, I want to come on to some remaining questions, having looked at some of the division of this, and go a bit deeper into our analysis of all that we've seen. The first thing is that I understand, and I've been here before with the New Dawn, that people really want to be hopeful. People want to give this government a chance. This election was exhausting. people don't necessarily want gridlock and political squabbles and fights. They just want to see a government that delivers. And even though they have some question marks over the ANC and its corruption, or the DA and its racism, or these small parties and their capacity to deliver, people just want to feel a little bit of hope again. And I completely understand that sentiment. So do I, and so does every South African. If we could wake up tomorrow, press a button, and have uninterrupted electricity for the rest of our lives, better water infrastructure, no potholes on the roads, just a government that delivered, and working street lights, and a solution to spatial inequality, and a wise resolution to the land reform issue, and a healthcare system that actually made sure that people who are sick get better for not too much money, and an education system that helped people become competitive in the job market, and just enlightened individuals. All of that would be wonderful, and that's what everyone really wants deep down. And I think one weird outcome of this election, but maybe hopeful, is that we really saw the difference between political party rhetoric and, when it comes down to it, what people really want. Because all those 11 parties in this multi-party coalition pretended to be arch enemies and fierce rivals, and at the first opportunity to work together, they abandoned all of that election rhetoric and months of attacking each other, and came together around a minimum set of policies. So I completely appreciate people's desire to be hopeful. But my job is not to feed people false hope or to be a praise singer for the government on this channel, I've decided. My job is always to try and give you a critical perspective. Not because criticism for criticism's sake is, a wonderful thing to do. It's not. It's to inject a certain amount of realism and insight into your understanding of the country. And I must say, this was really tough for me during the opening months and years of the first Ramaphosa administration, because I saw exactly the same kind of hope building up in people. They thought that things would turn around immediately. They thought this would be a perfect presidency, and any critical voice was called negative. Now, I just want to be realistic about what this government can achieve. And it's important that people don't allow euphoria and a sense of expectation to overtake a cold look at the data. And I'm not very sure that this government is going to sail through without massive challenges. So at least at this stage, what I'd like to do is give you a sense of what those challenges could be, because I feel like this is getting lost in the stampede to congratulate this government. Now, and I say this as well because voices in the media landscape who are critical are at an all-time low. So someone has to do it. Otherwise, everyone's just saying the same thing, and then the public is misinformed. And then everyone wonders why things haven't gone the way they hoped they would. And then disillusionment sets in. So we swing between these extremes of high expectation and high disillusionment, and the truth gets lost somewhere in the middle. So here are some questions that I have for this government. The first is, how will this cabinet actually function? For the first time, we have the DA in cabinet. But we have a very different situation in this coalition government to what we had in the government of national unity in '94. There was a constitutional mandate to have that government be a multi-party formation. Here, it is of the own choosing of the parties who are there. Now, we know that at certain crucial junctures, the political incentives in this cabinet will push these parties apart. However, the cabinet imperatives will pull them together. And I don't know at this moment, with such diverse views within this cabinet, ranging from the PAC all the way to the Freedom Front Plus, how, when those political tests arrive, this cabinet will remain united and solid. If the negotiation process is anything to go by, there's a great deal of distrust in the ranks. There's a great deal of leaking that is already happening. So what happens when key cabinet decisions, which are dividing the nation, get leaked in advance? Is there disciplinary action taken? Do parties walk away? We know that even the constitutionally mandated government of national unity only lasted 2 years. How long can this cabinet pretend to be united when we know deep down that there are agendas at play which are likely to pull and push the parties apart? At a practical level, how will cabinet debates happen so that it's not just a free-for-all where everyone gets to say whatever they want, and then at the end of the day the president tries to create some kind of fake consensus that is actually what no one wants, and the country is then left, as it was for this month in between the election, without any decisions ever really happening because there's so much consultation that has to happen in advance. So if I'm the president, I'm thinking to myself, look, I've got 5 years at best, maybe 3 years. I have done all this work to position myself for power. And I now have a unique opportunity that is never going to come again to be decisive and to say to those who disagree with the agenda, they can actually go and jump. Will President Ramaphosa eventually get to the point, which we've been waiting for? We've been told about this long game. Well, his presidency is about to run out. How long is the long game? Are we going to wait until 21 until real things happen? So I'll be fascinated to see, how does Cyril Ramaphosa play this? Will he play this like he played the ANC game and just try to make everyone happy and keep the ship going and keep the ship stable and inching forward? Or is he going to actually use this moment, maybe to free himself up from some of the ANC internal party dynamics and just govern the way he wants to govern? So I think there is that great danger of gridlock, of uncertainty, and of endless consultation. And to ignore that is just to be naive. How will this government deal with tests from the outside world and unforeseen tests? Governing is not an easy thing, even with a single party. How will this government deal with a pandemic? How will this government deal with a war? How will this government deal with a Trump presidency? How will this government deal with instability in the region? How will this government deal with Africa's place in the world, with BRICS, with a rising China? The world doesn't wait for a coalition government to give itself time to become coherent. And I give it a week. I literally give it a week before this government will have to face a test that it could not predict. And this cabinet will have to discuss things that are hard. I can understand that this cabinet is united maybe on an agenda of the problems they can foresee. But what happens when a problem that this cabinet or no one can foresee hits? That could be the key test to see whether this cabinet actually comes together in a crisis or whether the crisis actually undermines this cabinet. I just don't know practically yet exactly how it works between these ideological divisions. What are the different calculations of the parties going into the local government election? If we look at it like this government it's probably going to take 6 months for it to find its feet, to be quite honest, which takes us to 2025. Then the government has a year to govern properly. And then we're literally on the doorstep of another election in 2026, and that election could happen early or halfway through the year, but we're in another election campaign. And how are parties going to campaign? How will the DA campaign in an election where it is the government and not the opposition? And how will the ANC campaign? All of that, just we're staring at a very interesting, I'm just putting them as questions at this point for people to be mindful of. An interesting question for me: how does this arrangement, this arrangement, cascade down into the provincial and the local spheres? So I think we're likely to see an announcement in Gauteng. To what extent will the DA wield power in Gauteng? To what extent will they maybe regain some of the ground they lost inside cabinet in Gauteng? Could we see them taking as much as a half of that Gauteng government, or a sizable amount, and important portfolios there? And how will it cascade down in cities? Is the DA eyeing Joburg and maybe Tshwane? They've got Tshwane already, Ekurhuleni, for example. Is the DA eyeing control in the metros of Gauteng, as well as the provincial government? And maybe it's reason that it wants to give up control in cabinet so it can have its 6 seats. But if it can really gain control in Gauteng and really start to demonstrate that it's actually turning that province around, this is its calculation, I suspect, then it can go into the 2026 local government elections very strong. So I'm very interested to see what happens in the provinces, but then in the metros. I'm keeping an eye on eThekwini, I'm keeping an eye on Joburg, I'm keeping an eye on Nelson Mandela Bay, I'm keeping an eye on Ekurhuleni. So, that's an overview of this cabinet announcement. I'm hoping it's given you food for thought, and once again I would just implore you to please like, share and subscribe, because we're really on a mission on this channel to be an alternative voice, to give you a different perspective. Now, I know many people think there's some deep, sinister agenda as part of this channel. There's no agenda other than the fact that we want to give you a different perspective. It doesn't mean this perspective is the only perspective you should ever consume. You should take all different forms of media and really make up your own mind. And what this channel tries to do is it tries to give you a perspective and then sit back and allows you to make up your own mind. That's why you'll see in my interviews. And I've interviewed people from across the political spectrum. I very seldom jump in and say, yeah, but I think this and I think that. And I trust this audience to be smart enough to listen to me with an open mind, but also a critical mind. I don't get everything right, and I don't expect everyone to agree with me. All I'm trying to do here is help you understand South African politics from a different perspective. And that perspective is crucial to add to your arsenal of perspectives. So that's what we're trying to do here. And if you support that mission, then, like, share, subscribe, all the way to advertise, all the way to, invite me to speak at your institution. Buy a book, buy a hoodie, check out the SMWX hoodie. The description and the links are all below. Help us get to 200,000 subscribers. But most importantly, I'm keen to know what you think. What do you make of this announcement? What do you make of this new government? Are you hopeful? Are you fearful? Now, of course, in this episode, I have left out the opposition, which is rallying and strategizing and plotting. And in another episode, which will be released soon after this one, I want to take a look at what opposition parties like the EFF, MK, the ATM will be thinking, what this means for them, whether it leaves them isolated or with an opportunity to be an important counterweight to the power that has now amassed around the multi-party coalition. Thanks for riding with me once again on SMWX. Keep it locked here, and we'll meet on the next installment. Ayeye.